A continent is suffocating right now. Today, not in a scientific model, not in a dire prediction for the future, but in the brick and stone houses of Paris, Berlin, and Madrid. 1,300 people are dead. That is not an estimate. That is not a worst-case scenario. That is the formal, documented death toll confirmed by the World Health Organization for a single week in late June. A number they know is already wrong, and here is the part nobody is talking about. The real number, the one calculated by scientists at Indiana University watching this unfold, is closer to 20,000. 20,390 people dead in 7 days. This is not a heat wave. It is a mass casualty event happening in silence. So, what happens when a continent built for the cold is superheated to its breaking point? Here is the number you need to hold in your head. 2 degrees. For decades, it was the abstract global target, a warning for the distant future. But Europe is not the globe. The European State of the Climate Report, released just this past April, confirmed a brutal reality. Europe is warming at twice the global average. It is the fastest warming continent on Earth. That is not a projection. That is not a climate model's guess. That is the measured, documented arithmetic of a continent accelerating into a future it was never built to withstand. And in the summer of 2026, that future arrived. It began in late May. An enormous stationary bubble of Saharan air, a heat dome, settled over the continent and refused to move. The temperatures started to climb, first into the 30s Celsius, then higher. On June 23, 2026, the city of Paris recorded 40.9 degrees Celsius, 105 degrees Fahrenheit. It was the hottest June day in the entire measured history of France. In Bordeaux, the thermometer hit 42.1. In Germany, a nation known for temperate summers, the temperature reached a historic 41.7 degrees Celsius. And in the south of Spain, in the towns of Anjar and Montoro, the peak of the thermal siege arrived. 45.1 degrees Celsius, 113 degrees Fahrenheit. Records did not just fall, they were obliterated. The scale of this event is difficult to comprehend. The European Union's Copernicus Climate Change Service released its data on July 9th. It confirmed that for Western Europe, June 2026 was the hottest June ever recorded, not by a small fraction. The surface air temperature was 3.06 degrees Celsius, above the recent historical average. That is not a bad summer. That is a fundamental dislocation of the climate system, a deviation so extreme it sits outside the bounds of what was considered possible just 2 decades ago. Samantha Burgess, a lead scientist at Copernicus, stated it plainly. The climate system is continuing to accumulate heat. The result is increasingly intense heat waves. The heat is not just visiting, it is moving in. And then there are the images that make the numbers impossible to ignore. In Germany, the heat became so extreme that steel train tracks began to warp and bend. Rail operators had no choice. They imposed strict speed limits across the network, slowing the arteries of the national economy because the ground itself was giving way. In the United Kingdom, roads began to physically melt. Asphalt turned to a sticky black tar, clinging to tires. In some boroughs, entire fleets of new electric garbage trucks, not built for this kind of ambient heat, simply broke down. Refuse collection stopped. The garbage piled up in the sweltering streets. This is not the inconvenience of a hot day. This is the beginning of systemic failure. The point where the mundane, invisible infrastructure that holds modern life together starts to fracture under a thermal load it was never engineered to carry. To understand why this is happening, you have to look at Europe from space. The European Space Agency's Sentinel-3 satellite gave us a perspective that the thermometers on the ground could not. While the air in Spain and France was baking at 40 degrees, the satellite's instruments measured the temperature of the ground itself. The dark asphalt of roads, the stone of city plazas, the baked earth of fields. The reading came back. 55 degrees Celsius, 131 degrees Fahrenheit. That is not the weather. That is the temperature of a frying pan. That is the reality faced by an outdoor worker, a delivery driver, or an unhoused person trying to survive on streets that have turned into stovetops. Air, versus ground. The difference between those two numbers is the difference between a crisis you read about and a crisis you feel through the soles of your shoes. This thermal assault is what Dr. Tedros Adhanom Ghebreyesus, the Director General of the World Health Organization, described as the work of a silent killer. The term sounds like melodrama. It is not. It is a precise description of how this heat wave is actually claiming its victims. The deaths are not dramatic. They are quiet. They are happening behind the closed doors of homes that were never designed for this. European architecture, for centuries, was a masterpiece of thermal retention. Thick stone walls in Paris, dense brick in London. Buildings designed to capture the warmth of a winter fire and hold it through long, cold nights. In the summer of 2026, those same beautiful historic homes have become ovens. Here is the part that should stop you cold. Air conditioning is not a common feature of European life. In France, the adoption rate is estimated to be below 25%. In Germany and the UK, it is less than 5%. For generations, it was never needed. The climate was mild, summer nights were cool, but now the heat dome has introduced a new, lethal phenomenon to the continent. Tropical nights. A technical designation for a night where the temperature never drops below 20 degrees Celsius, or 68 degrees Fahrenheit. For the human body, this is a critical threshold. Sleep is when the body is supposed to offload the heat stress accumulated during the day. It is a period of physiological recovery. When the night itself remains hot, that recovery never happens. The stress compounds, the kidneys, the heart, the entire cardiovascular system is pushed and pushed and pushed. For an elderly person, for someone with a pre-existing condition. The third or fourth tropical night in a row is often the breaking point. The body simply gives up. Renal failure, cardiovascular collapse, a quiet death in a top-floor apartment in a building that has become a tomb. This is the mechanism of the silent killer, and it is why the initial count of 1,300 deaths is just the tip of a catastrophic iceberg. The official number, 1,300 dead since June 21st, is what coroners could link directly and immediately to the heat. But that is not how heat mortality works. The real toll is measured in excess deaths. Scientists compare the total number of people who died in a given week to the historical average for that same week. The difference is the excess. It captures the heart attacks, the strokes, the organ failures that were triggered by the heat but not officially recorded as such. The Rapid Response Study from Indiana University, published in the BMJ, did exactly that for the week of June 22nd to June 28th. Their projection is not 1,300. It is 20,390. 20,000 people. Gone, not a prediction for the future. An accounting of what has already happened. And you can see the desperation on the ground. In Paris, where municipal authorities tried to blockade access to the canals for safety reasons, people simply ignored them. They tore down fences and plunged into the murky water of the Canal Saint-Martin, seeking any escape from the suffocating air. The images are a surreal portrait of a first-world city under climate siege. In Berlin, the authorities deployed a tool normally reserved for civil unrest: riot control water cannons. They drove them into public parks and sprayed massive arcs of water over sweltering crowds, not to disperse a protest, but to prevent mass heat stroke. A weapon of crowd control, repurposed as a life-saving public health measure. That single image tells you everything you need to know about the failure of conventional planning. When the police are using water cannons as sprinklers, the system has been pushed into the realm of pure improvisation. This crisis did not emerge from a vacuum. It was preceded by warnings, decades of them, but also by direct precedents that were ignored. The European heatwave of 2003 was a defining catastrophe. An estimated 70,000 people died. At the time, it was viewed as a once-in-a-generation anomaly, a statistical fluke. Then came the summer of 2022, another continent-wide heat dome. This time, the excess death toll was over 60,000. It was no longer a fluke, it was a pattern. But even after two such brutal events, the prevailing narrative, especially online and among older generations, was one of dismissal. They would point to the legendary hot summer of 1976, They would say, it's always been this hot. We survived it then, we can survive it now. That argument is now scientifically bankrupt. A team at World Weather Attribution, an academic collaboration that calculates the fingerprint of climate change on extreme events, ran the numbers. They compared the conditions of 2026 to the climate of 1976. Their conclusion was absolute. The temperatures reached in June 2026 would have been virtually impossible in 1976. Furthermore, the lethal tropical nights that are killing people in their sleep are now 100 times more likely to occur than they were just in 2003. This is not your grandfather's heat wave. This is a different animal operating in a different world with a lethality that has no historical parallel. The debate is over. The data is in. The climate that Europe was built in, the climate of 1976, no longer exists, and the consequences keep metastasizing. The heat is not just killing people directly, it is setting the continent on fire. As of early July 2026, massive wildfires are raging across France, Spain, Portugal, and Greece. Over 20,000 hectares have been razed. That is an area larger than the city of Washington, D.C. On July 5th, a massive blaze erupted in the Pyrénées-Orientales department of France. It took 700 firefighters to even begin to contain it. 10,000 people were forced to evacuate their homes, fleeing a wall of flame driven by superheated winds. This is the second-order effect of the heat dome. First, it bakes the land. It kills the vegetation, turning forests into tinder. Then, any spark, an accident, a forgotten campfire, a lightning strike, becomes an inferno. The firefighters battling these blazes are working in the same extreme heat that is killing people in the cities, wearing heavy gear, pushing their own bodies to the absolute limit. The crisis is also moving from the air to the ground into the water systems. Just yesterday, on July 10th, major water providers in the United Kingdom announced their first hosepipe bans in decades. Cambridge Water, Anglian Water. The prohibitions went into effect today, July 11th, after the UK experienced its own surge of heat, with temperatures hitting 35.5 degrees Celsius in Wisley. The reservoirs have started to drop. The green landscapes of England are beginning to show the strain. A hosepipe ban seems minor, a small inconvenience, but it is a critical indicator. It is a utility company formally admitting that the water supply can no longer keep up with demand. It is the first step on a ladder of restrictions that ends in a place no one wants to go. The very fabric of daily life is starting to fray, not from a single dramatic event, but from the relentless, grinding pressure of heat and dryness. What makes this more than just a story about bad weather is the collision of this new climate reality with the old world. Dr. Sarah Perkins Kirkpatrick, a climate scientist at the Australian National University, has been one of the most prominent voices analyzing this event. Her assessment is blunt. European countries must radically adapt their physical infrastructure. But how do you do that? How do you retrofit a city like Paris? The city's iconic Haussmannian apartment blocks, with their zinc roofs and thick limestone walls, are protected by strict heritage and zoning laws. You cannot simply cut holes in the facades to install modern window unit air conditioners. The city's very identity is tied to an architectural style that is now a deadly liability. And even if they could, the power grid is not ready. European electricity grids were built for a world without mass air conditioning. They are designed for a peak load in the winter, for heating, not a peak load in the summer, for cooling. A sudden chaotic rush by millions of people to buy and install AC units would create demand spikes that could lead to brownouts and blackouts, potentially disabling the very system needed to power fans and life-saving medical equipment. Europe is caught in an infrastructure trap. The buildings are wrong for the new climate. The power grid is wrong for the solution. There is no easy fix. There is no switch to flip. What you are watching is a continent forced to confront a fundamental mismatch between what it is and what the sky above it has become. The problem is not the heat alone. It is the heat combined with decisions made centuries ago, with materials chosen to solve a problem that no longer exists. The problem is a way of life built on the assumption of a stable, predictable climate. That assumption has been invalidated. It has been broken, day after day, by thermometers reading 40.9, 41.7, 45 degrees Celsius. Every system has a breaking point. We are now watching an entire continent search for where that point is. We see it in the firefighters in the south of France, standing against a wall of flame. We see it in the train engineers in Germany, forced to slow their locomotives to a crawl. We see it in the families in Paris, defying the law to find a moment of relief in a polluted canal. We see it in the health officials, grimly counting the dead, knowing their numbers are a fraction of the truth. And we see it in the scientists, like Samantha Burgess, who can only state the facts. The heat is accumulating. The records will continue to fall. Look again at the numbers. 1,300 confirmed dead. A number published on June 29th, covering only the first week of the most intense heat. We are now in mid-July. The heat continues. The wildfires burn. The reservoirs are dropping. That number has not been updated. But the silent killer has not stopped. The tropical nights continue. The brick buildings continue to bake their inhabitants. The real-time accounting from Indiana University, projecting over 20,000 dead for that same single week, gives a more honest picture of the scale. A picture of a slow-motion disaster that does not get the same attention as an earthquake or a hurricane, because its victims die quietly, out of sight. The World Health Organization was not being poetic when they called Europe the fastest warming continent. They were stating a fact with lethal consequences. Warming at twice the global average means that Europe is the laboratory for what happens when the climate buffer is gone. It is the front line. The place where the future that scientists have warned about for 30 years is no longer in the future. It is the measured reality as of this morning. You can still buy a postcard showing a romantic European summer, a sidewalk cafe in Paris, a beer garden in Munich. But that is the Europe of memory. The Europe of today is the one where riot police use water cannons to save lives. The one where garbage rots in the streets because the trucks have melted. The one where you cannot trust the night to bring relief. This is the summer of 2026, a season that will be defined not by tourism, but by its body count. And the question that hangs over the continent in the shimmering, superheated air is the only one that matters now.